It's been a while since I've made a video in my Writing for 8th Blackbird series, and even though it's not the most popular iron I've got in the proverbial fire, a number of you have asked me, either in comments or in emails, what the status of the piece is and if it'll be released, either the piece itself or the next episode in this particular series. So, about that. A number of ensembles, especially one as well-renowned as 8th Blackbird, don't allow their group's name to be associated with any old audio recordings that are not explicitly sanctioned by them. And this is done in order to protect and assure the quality of their releases. They want to have creative control over the mixing and making sure that if they have a bad take, that's not released into the public and misrepresents the quality of their performers. I am free to do with the recording what I wish, as long as I never make any indication that the recording was by 8th Blackbird, which puts me in a bit of a bind. I don't want to put myself in a bind, but I can't use any audio excerpts from the recording session. That's just the way it is. I can use it to apply to grad schools, I can use it to apply to summer festivals, and I can have it. I can even theoretically publish it so long as I didn't make any indication that they were the ones who recorded it, but considering I'm making this series about this one piece, it would be very easy to connect the dots. Having said that, I want to go through the piece basically page by page, talk a little bit about why I did, what I did, where I did. So, I'm the classical nerd and I've written for 8th Blackbird. First and foremost, the title of the piece has changed. Once again, very little surprise there. The piece is now called Invasion of the Minor Seconds, which in large part refers to what became of the compositional process and how the piece ended up holding together on the most prominent surface level. I like a cool font, so here's a cool font. While the previous titles were good starting points, they ended up not being really accurate for the direction the piece went in. The first page specifies the instrumentation in score order, which is really helpful to do on pretty much any piece, but especially one where there's a variable instrumentation, in this case percussion. Initially I had some more exotic instruments like a wind machine and a thunder sheet, but I decided that if the piece is ever going to have a life outside this one particular recording session, it needed to be scaled down and made more realistic to play for smaller groups. This is also why the crotales are optional. I love them, but they're only used a grand total of once, and that's at the very end of the piece. I wouldn't want an eventual performance of this piece to be nixed due to lacking a set of crotales, so when the crotales come in, I make a note that they may be replaced by glockenspiel, which is used throughout, and is much more common. Underneath come the performance notes, and there are plenty of ways to do this. I chose to split it up by instrument and its relevancy to whatever technique I'm talking about, so the microtones are only listed under instruments that have the capability to perform microtones. Initially I also included the 3/4 sharp and 3/4 flat, but considering the nature of the piece, replacing them with just these two was a more straightforward solution. If you're working with a language that has more traditional pitch centers throughout, or if you're particular about quarter tone and voice leading, you can use the ones I discarded. And I've used them myself plenty of times before, just not in the final incarnation of this piece that was put before the ensemble. Sometimes the spelling of the pitches in what would otherwise be a correct fashion is just not conducive to a really crisp recording session when there's limited time to get everything down. Quarter tones are challenging enough to perform, although not as much for 8th Blackbird, but there's no reason to make them any harder than they absolutely have to be. Reading just 1/4 sharp is easier than reading, say, 3/4 flat. The Quinary Augmentation dot still needs explanation because sadly not everyone in the musical world has seen my video on it. In this case, only the strings and piano ever have a note that's held for that particular value, so it's listed under them, and the rest is pretty straightforward. The score is in C because that's what 8th Blackbird wanted in the full score. However, the clarinet part was still transposed. This opening section is extremely ethereal, and this opening clarinet line is one that eventually comes back. Because most of this was written fairly early on in the process, before I had a clear image of what I really wanted to do with the piece, there's a lesser degree of motivic connection between this section and much of the rest, although it does have significance in the end, one of the leftovers from when I thought the piece was going to have much more of a palindromic arch form. What helped me glue these sections together turned out to be a dense harmonic palette full of minor seconds. Now the question is, why the minor second? And the answer is that I don't entirely know why. That's why they invaded. But what I do know is about the minor second is that it sounds fundamentally different when inverted. So the major seventh has unique properties. But that can be said of any interval that inverts to a different interval. So basically everything but the octave and the tritone. To some extent or another, they have different properties. but it's also the only interval I can think of that changes a second time when you stick an octave in between. So a minor ninth is very different from either a major seventh or a minor second. Not only that, but I've also thought that certain instruments, like the vibraphone for instance, handle dissonances better. You can play a minor ninth on the vibes, and it somehow doesn't come across as the same level of dissonance that you'd get on, say, the piano. The harsher the attack, the more prominent the dissonance is. I think this is why Eric Whitacre gets away with such dissonances in his choral writing, because voices can really hide those dissonances. Measure 17 is one of those places where I fuse sections composed at different times into one solid section. This is because it introduces the first use of the pseudoprime scale I talked about in previous episodes. The entire scale is assembled into a chord which is heard as a simultaneity on the downbeat of measure 19, and then linearly twice, ending in the violin in exchange of thirds, heavily reminiscent of the opening clarinet line. From there, the music moves on to the aggressive section, which was composed relatively early on. It gets quite chromatic and is certainly intended to be kaleidoscopic in its orchestration. In many ways, it is conceived almost orchestrally. The minor second is now embodied in the doublings. Measure 41, there's the piano with the same melody as the vibraphone, but a major seventh up. This is one of the unifying aspects of the piece. There's this continued use of this one particular interval as not just an interval necessarily, but as an intervallic coloristic effect, which is heightened by these orchestrational choices. When I recognized that, I was able to really capitalize upon it, and that ended up giving the piece a final title, not to mention a formal cohesiveness, because I chose to approach some of the orchestrational choices with the same underlying formula. Moving ahead to measure 51, there's this exchange in the winds that also comes back in a different form, before the music builds up starting at rehearsal E, which builds up to this use of interlocking thirds that, again, define the very first motif of the entire piece. So there is a continued reference to things that happened before. Measure 67 is perhaps one of my personal favorites because there's something on every pulse, but it's just bouncing around like mad. Soon after that are measures 74 and 75, where the strings and winds are playing the same line, while the vibes are doubling all of that at either a major seventh or minor ninth. It alternates on every beat, and the piano is just plucking out these minor seconds. After a transitionary section, the texture changes to one that's more multi-layered, with the opening clarinet line coming back, both scales in counterpoint between the violin and cello, and then the triplet figure bouncing around between the winds and the violin. This was one of the later sections to be written because so much of this stuff is returning, but even then I have rather free elements, that is, stuff that's not tied down to a previous idea or figure underneath all this, especially in the piano. From here, the violin line that is marked aggressive towards the beginning comes back, but is taken in another direction, including a kind of funky piano interlude that then wallops you in the face with a whole bunch of minor seconds and runs in both scales, up to the big simultaneities that I put together at the piano way back towards the very beginning of the compositional process, what was documented in a previous episode. These chords then lead to the end, which of course has the quarter tone harmonies that generated all of the scalar material in the first place. So you can see that the most obvious iteration of these scalar patterns come at the very end of the piece. They're disguised in their previous iterations. This is a kind of reverse of what you'd expect of a statement and then a variation. In this case, the variation comes before the statement, but they all are linked together because it's not really a formal idea. It's just some kind of underlying formal formula, I guess. So the question is what to make of the form. In large part, the single most definitive question of composition, contemporary or otherwise, is how one deals with form. In my own brief analysis of the piece, which I had to do when I submitted this piece for my jury, I described the formal design of the invasion as an experiment in crafting underlying links between sections that are not only extremely subtle, but also not necessarily stated in a traditionally linear order of exposition and development. Ideas were free to roam around and can be developed before their exposition. In many cases, they lack an exposition altogether, whether by choice or because their material isn't really expository. These interrelated scales, the minor second in its inversions, the opening clarinet line, the triplet figure, and the aggressive line in the violin are all used as the glue that helps stick the piece together. The last thing I wanted to do was to have an abstract formal plan at the outset and then fill it. Instead, I wanted to craft a compositional process as much as a piece, a process that strikes the balance between composition by intuition and composition based on more formulaic and traditional approaches to formal layout and practices. One thing I've tried to do in a lot of my pieces, not just this one, was answer the question of how small formal elements can become before they're subsumed into the texture, and is the resulting piece coherent? Do you need a full-on repetition of a certain idea or a certain section to make a piece tie together, or can those formal elements that serve to make a piece coherent, can they be under the surface? Can they be on the subconscious level as opposed to the conscious? Answering that last question is a great and nearly impossible challenge for a creative artist because we're so intimately tied to what we've created that seeing one's own work from the perspective of a third party takes time to learn, if you're even capable of doing it in the first place.